showing my face and spilling the beans about all this really sensitive and I guess some of it is also embarrassing stuff just about my life and my feelings about Islam, I would have told you no way.
By quite a few.
But what I was going to kind of push, because this question here, I think if it's left unanswered, a lot of people will have doubts on your position. That if someone gave you a Quran which is empty in terms of there's nothing on it, and gave you a pen, obviously you have the Quran with the qira'at. Obviously you can do isti'ana with what's maktub. But the question is, would what you write in that mushaf correspond with any? I'm not saying it's mutawatir. I'm saying would it be sahih, authentic? Would it correspond with anything that we have in terms of the riwayat and the qira'at? If the answer is no, then for all intents and purposes, what you could be portrayed as saying is that you have a view which is not only completely anti-normative, but is beyond the scope of what was written for 1,400 years. So someone will say
if it's beyond the scope, no, akhi, who's going to bring a new Quran? A'udhu billah. We're going to have the Quran there, but which qira'ah will it be in? It'll be probably a mixture, right? It's not going to be necessarily. Fine. Yeah, okay. So let's leave it at that. It's not going to be the exact Hafs and Asim bi riwayati fulan or Shu'ba. This is something that is coming at a later stage. Okay. The codification of the qira'at is coming in the 2nd, 3rd century of the Hijrah.
But you would have something which you could say is sahih.
Fully recognizable by the average Muslim, obviously. Ya akhi, a'udhu billah, we're not presenting something that's
no, I'm sorry to push on it, but the reason why is because I know how take your kalam.
Okay. Of course it will be fully recognizable. Obviously, akhi, so yes, if that's what you're asking, then a'udhu billah. Okay, so you got my mind thinking in a much more advanced level. No. Obviously, if we were to present empty
mushaf.
You could. So the issue comes. There's a problem. The problem is very simple. Are you certain that that's the way that it was in early Medina? Because just like the codification occurred. But what you would have, let me put it this way, would definitely be something the average Muslim recognizes and understands and will not.
And all of it is verbatim from Allah.
This is in the hadith, ya akhi. It's exactly هَكَذَا unzil. It's literally what the Prophet said. هَكَذَا unzil.
Eminent scholar and author Ibn Warraq.
You cannot leave your religion. It's a one-way ticket, You cannot leave Islam without being punished for it. Clearly states, that apostasy is punishable by death. In my less charitable moments, I find that so-called moderate Muslims are really rather dishonest. They pretend that the real Islam is tolerant, that the real Islam is pro-women, the real Islam is for freedom of expression. It's nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. Islamic slavery was far worse than anything that happened in the West. The Atlantic slave trade. Arabs shipped 17 million black Africans to the Middle East, to the Ottoman Empire, to Arabia. I've been quiet when I should have spoken up.
What held you back? Do you think Islam can be reformed? Hello and welcome to the Winston Marshall Show with me, Winston Marshall. I had the privilege of sitting down with historian, scholar and author Ibn Warraq. Ibn has been writing about Islam and Muhammad for a long time. We took a deep dive into the history of Islam, the history of Muhammad, the evidence in the scripture, what the truth might be. We looked at previous guests, what they've said on this show. As you've been following, you will have similar questions to me. We also went into Ibn's life, his personal journey, his what I think is a very courageous journey, speaking up when few others feel they can. All of that and much more. Before listening, I ask if you want to support the show, all you have to do is press subscribe. You press the subscribe button, I can have more wonderful, incredible guests like Ibn Warraq discussing the issues you want to hear about. But without further ado, Ibn Warraq. Maybe you can tell me and listeners and viewers who don't know your story I think it's quite amazing that you've from India originally. You became one of the preeminent scholars and writers, authors of several books, including Why I'm Not a Muslim, and you live under a pen name of a nom de plume to disguise your identity, as I've understood it, for reasons I'd like to hear about. But maybe you can tell your story from India to where you are now.
Yes, I was born in a city called Rajkot, which is still a part of India. In fact, Gandhi grew up there, although he was not born there. He was Gujarati. He was born on the coast in Porbandar. Anyway, my father was a nominal Muslim. His father persuaded him to leave India and go to the newly created state of Pakistan in 1947. So when I was just one and a half, we moved, my family and I, we moved to Karachi, Pakistan. And from there, my father thought there was no real future in this theocratic state like Pakistan, and decided to send it to England. That's to say, me and my brother, who was a year and a half older than I was. And I went to prep school and then to public school in the British sense in England. And then I went on to Edinburgh University, where I studied Arabic and Persian, amongst other things. And then I became involved with some secular humanists. I realized I was really an atheist and certainly a humanist. And I got in touch with an organization called the Center for Inquiry, founded by a philosopher, American philosopher called Paul Kurtz. I started writing for them, for their magazine called Free Inquiry. And I wrote an article for them, a short article called Why I'm Not Muslim, because they had been looking for somebody to write something on Islam. They had been writing, they had a series of speakers, writers who wrote Why I'm Not and then a Mormon, Why I'm Not a Jew, Why I'm Not a Methodist, and so on.
Bertrand Russell's famous article, Why I'm Not a Christian.
Calc on his work. They couldn't find anybody to do something on Islam, so I volunteered to do it. And my article turned into a book. So,
why do you think they couldn't find anyone to do it on Islam?
Well, they just were not in touch with many ex-Muslims. They just did not know of any. It was much easier to, obviously in America at the time, it was in the 1990s, to find somebody, from the Christian religion and all its offshoots.
Is that because there aren't many Muslim apostates, or is that because...
Well, at the time, this was, I think, around about 1989, I first wrote the article. They just didn't know that many people, many ex-Muslims, in fact. They were not used to having arguments or dialogues with Muslims generally at the time. And when they saw my name in some other journal, I forget what, they chopped at the idea of recruiting me to do this article on Why I'm Not a Muslim.
Your turn from, was it more against Islam or is it more towards atheism? Because your writing is very critical of Islam. At that point in your life, what was your spiritual journey? How did you become...
Well, I realized that I was really a skeptic, and my favorite reading by then, I was 18, 19 by then. I think I was married by now. Yeah, I was married, and my favorite authors are people like Gibbon and John Stuart Mill, various secular humanists in America, like Paul Kurtz himself, and I realized that I myself was a skeptic, really, and I was keen to do something for the Islamic side of things. And I had studied, I was not particularly a brilliant student, but I had studied Arabic and so on at Edinburgh University. So I was happy to go back to those educational roots.
Was your interest in Arabic because of your interest in Islam at that point?
When I decided to go to Edinburgh, I wanted to really study European art history. But I had a kind of crisis of identity, and I thought perhaps I'll try and find out a little bit more about Islam and my Islamic identity. That's why I chose Arabic and Islamic studies at Edinburgh, which just happened to. I mean, it's a sheer coincidence, really, in a way. It had a very famous, reputable scholar of Islam, a man called Professor Montgomery Watt, who'd written a 3-volume biography of Muhammad, the Prophet, which was very positive. I think one of the earliest really positive biographies of Muhammad. This was must have been written in the late 60s, I think. I can't remember the exact dates now. But so, yeah, that was one of the reasons I chose Islam, to get at my roots, my intellectual roots.
Having a crisis of identity at that age is interesting. This is one of the phenomena I think we're seeing in Britain, particularly of second-generation immigrants to Britain, where they don't necessarily feel at home in English culture, so they turn towards their Muslim heritage and to the mosques, and that seems to be one of the crux points of the problems of integration at the moment in Britain. I wonder if you have insight into that. Why do you think you had an identity crisis?
One of the reasons is I wasn't sure that I would really ever be really accepted as an Englishman. I mean, I really, in my head, in my upbringing and so on, up from the age of 10 onwards, I had become an Englishman. I wrote about that in one of my books. When I was, above all, when I was coming back into England from a trip abroad in France, for example, I remember arriving at Dover with I think I still had a Pakistani passport at the time, and being asked, where I was from and so on. And then people later on would say, "Where are you really from?" And I got rather upset at the time. And then
Do you think that was on account of your race? Or
because of my looks,
Pakistani?
I didn't look. Yeah, exactly. It was based on looks, essentially. In fact, I remember once when I was studying philosophy afterward at Birkbeck College, I mentioned the fact that I thought Bertrand Russell had a wonderful literary style. And my friend saying to me, "Well, yeah, of course you would notice that, because an Englishman wouldn't notice that. You being foreigner would notice that."
What a peculiar comment.
It was very odd, and I felt very upset about that as well. So, I mean, if you don't speak well, you're not English. If you speak well, you're speaking too well. Yeah. No Englishman speaks so correctly, and so on.
Yeah. So there's a sort of irony then, is that you lent in towards your Muslim heritage because of an identity crisis, not feeling included or not feeling like English people were necessarily including you as English. And then you come out the other end an atheist. So,
yeah,
so rejecting
I realized that that I really wasn't a Muslim. That it didn't help me at all going back to my Islamic roots.
So then there must have been a second identity crisis.
Yes, I was happy to acknowledge the fact that I was not a Muslim, and I was happy to write about my acquired Englishness. I was heavily into Englishness of English art, a la Pevsner, and I identified. I used to go to holidays in Norfolk, so the Norwich School of Painters and Artists and so on. I liked the Englishness of painters like Samuel Palmer and Mary Russell. It's the woman who wrote Our Village. Anyway, and
so it resonated with you. This
yes. I felt Hausmann's poetry. It was very much. I went to
Huysmans French, though, isn't he?
Hausmann, no, A. Hausmann, no.
Oh, sorry, I'm thinking.
I meant he wrote about Ludlow and Shropshire, the Shropshire lad. But in fact, he grew up in Worcestershire. That's where my prep school was. So I identified with him and his poetry. And there was also regional writers at that time. A man called who wrote under the pen name B.B. just with inverted commas around the two B's, and so many other things which resonated more with me than anything. That in fact, I no longer spoke any Urdu, which is the language I was born into, and a dialect which we spoke at home. We spoke Kutchi, which is related to Sindhi. We used to speak Kutchi with my grandmother. My mother was already dead when I was 1, and we spoke Urdu to my father. It was strange, but and the national language at the time in Pakistan was Urdu. So I'd forgotten by the time, after 3 years, I was really losing most of my, original languages.
What did your family make of you rejecting Islam?
No, they don't know. Still don't know. My father died while I was at Edinburgh in 1968. And my mother, I never knew. My brother doesn't know I've written all these books.
How could he not?
Well, because of the pen name. That's one of the reasons why I have a pen name, is to protect them. He wouldn't. My brother is a gentle soul. He would not dream of harming me. But I was afraid that relatives might take it out on him. My atheism and my apostasy might blow back on him. And I'm glad that I chose a pen name in the end. In fact, one Financial Times, I think it was, journalist suggested I reveal my real name, and then I was okay, I'll do it. And then he said, "Are you sure you really want to do it?" And I thought again about it, and I realized no, it would be just too much. And also, I was married by then. I had 2 children, and I thought it would put their lives in danger.
Why is it that you would put their lives in danger? Why is it that you felt that your brother might be under threat? Is this something that's unique to your family? Is this something that's unique to Islam? There's certainly, I've had Ayan Hirsi Ali, our mutual friend, on the show, famously has a fatwa, Salman Rushdie fatwa. Is it an Islam problem?
It is.
Or is it a more
No, it is
family issue?
Very much an Islam problem, and also a social, I don't know whether it's Islamic social circumstances or there tends to be very little private life in Islamic countries, especially Pakistan. People feel that they have the right to question you about the way you're bringing up your children and so on. In fact, amazingly enough, when I was going through Pakistan, almost exactly to the day, 30 years after I'd left, I was working for a French travel agency called Fram Voyage, and I was taking French tourists to Bangkok, and we had to pass through Karachi. And I took some time off to go and see one of my father's friends. And the first question, he hadn't seen me for 30 years, the very literally first question was, "Your children Muslim?" He said, "Are you bringing them up as Muslims?" And I already felt threatened. I hadn't written anything by then. This was about 1986. I left Pakistan at 1956, so exactly 30.
And that was a threat, not just a open question. It was like,
no, it felt very much like a threat to me. And then, of course, 3 years later, in 89, you had the famous Rushdie fatwa. There is very little respect for private space in Islam and in Islamic countries, anyway.
Is that a cultural issue, or is that a theological? How much is that tied to the religion itself? Or you could go from country to country, and it's very different norms in different Muslim countries.
It's very much a theological question. You cannot leave your religion. It's a one-way ticket. You cannot leave Islam without being punished for it.
Where are the roots of that? Is that from the Quran? Is that from
it is
Hadith?
Interpretations of various verses in the Quran. I think I mention it in one of my books. It's in the Hadith as well that apostates must be killed. They must be given a chance to recant, and then after the fourth occasion, then I must be put to death. It is definitely there in the Quran. And the theologians like Maududi, who's a Indian who became the spokesman for Pakistan. He was born obviously before partition, and he clearly states, that apostasy is punishable by death. Yeah.
Do you think? I mean, we might be going now a little bit into theology, and I'd love to come back to your story. But is this a fundamentalist Islam issue? Do you separate between Islam and fundamentalist Islam? There are peaceful sects of Islam. Is it pronounced
Ismailis?
Yeah, for example, high achieving group. If you look at, I look at the Emiratis today as leading the way for a peaceful Islam on a geopolitical, on that scale, and there seems to be that is it drastic to tar the whole 1 however many billion Muslims with the same brush, or is there separation there? Is there different sides to Islam?
Well, it's a question which is difficult to answer because I don't know. There are various so-called moderate Muslims who will be present on Wednesday when I speak, like Dr. Zudi Yaser, who says he's a moderate Muslim. He doesn't believe in jihad and all the... But
you're speaking, sorry, at Ayan Hirsi Ali's foundation in Washington, D.C.
That's right, on the 15th.
On the topic of?
On defending the West from all her detractors, her enemies, internal and external.
Well, we'll come back to that. But sorry, you were saying about the different Islams and moderate Muslims.
Yes. Now, I find that a very useful distinction, which I found in Bernard Lewis, who in fact became a friend. But he makes very little use of it, oddly enough. He just threw it out in one of his prefaces, which is between Islam 1, Islam 2, and Islam 3. Islam 1 is what's in the Quran and what the theologians developed. Okay, Islam 2 is what's in the Hadith and what the theologians constructed. And Islam 3 is Islamic civilization, what Muslims actually do rather than what they should do. So, for example, until recently, oddly enough, very ironical in a sense, homosexuality was much more tolerated in Islamic countries. And I quote, I forget which one of my books, my first one, I think, Why I'm Not a Muslim, the story told by an anthropologist, a British anthropologist, about how young boys were married off to grown men, and the whole ceremony was very much celebrated in public in a village in Egypt. It was quite open. And then there are stories.
What period is this? What year is it?
1930s. This he was writing in the 1930s.
As recently as the 1930s, that was happening.
Yeah. And there's I quote one story in my book. Compton Mackenzie, who's not much read these days, wrote a story about homosexuality. It must have been one of the earliest novels in English, written in the 1950s. About an English homosexual who went to North Africa, where he found that people were much more tolerant of his lifestyle.
So what changed then? What happened?
Well, this a new, more fundamentalist strain came into existence, especially with the rise of Khomeini.
So that's from 79, though.
70s.
So you think 1979 is the kind, or the 70s?
I think so, yeah.
It's the change point.
But 79, if you like, yeah.
So not just in the Shia Islamic world, across the entire.
He influenced. His influence went across all these.
How would that be? Because I thought that there was quite a big contention between the Shia and the Sunni. How did his reach go across the Sunni world?
It did because they found whatever they needed in his fundamentalist interpretation. Sayyid Qutb was a Sunni, but he drew inspiration from Maududi, for example.
Qutb was writing in the 20s. Is that right?
No, he was right. He wrote in the 60s, early 60s. Okay. I think he was executed in 66. I forget now. But he's certainly drew inspiration from whatever, across various boundaries. There's a lot of American analysts got this idea in their head that Sunnis and the Shias they never cooperate, that we're okay, we don't need to worry about Khomeini getting together with some regimes in the rest of the Islamic world, and they were proved wrong. And then now I'm not sure what the situation is. I know various intellectuals in the Islamic world were very much impressed with Khomeini and his uncompromising stance on these issues.
So they were impressed by his going back to more fundamental, literal interpretation of Muhammad's and his teachings in the Quran.
Right. Now, to answer your question, you do get some Islam 3, you get Muslims who are moderate, but Islam itself is not moderate. If you like, Islam 1 and 2 are not moderate. Islam 3, people who within Islamic civilization, some of them are moderate, some of them are not fundamentalists. But if you stick to the strict theology, then it is fundamentalist. What percentage and so on, I don't know.
Well, I can throw a quick percentage out. I found very eye-opening, to say the least, this is from about a month ago. The Henry Jackson Society published statistics about British Muslims, and there's about 4 million British Muslims. 76% don't believe there was rape and murder on October 7th in Israel, and a large percent support Hamas. So I'm quite curious, and I've asked previous guests about the moderate Muslims and who represents them. Where are those voices? I had Ed Hussein on the show, and I think he is one of the great moderate Islam voices or moderate Muslim voices. But I'm trying to get a context of how far spread or how widespread his version of Islam is. I wonder if you had insight into that.
No, I find that in my less charitable moments, I find that so-called moderate Muslims are really rather dishonest intellectually. They pretend that the real Islam is tolerant, that the real Islam is pro-women, that the real Islam is for freedom of expression. It's just it's nonsense. It's absolute nonsense.
Based on the scripture.
Yes, exactly. If you base it on Islam's 1 and 2, it clearly isn't. So, I mean, in a sense, who's been more? I suppose I could be accused of essentialism, saying what Islam is and Islam isn't. It's not up to me to decide. I'm not a Muslim anymore. Incidentally, I don't trust Ed Hussein at all.
Why not?
I think he indulges in double speak, but anyway, that's another matter.
You don't think it's an honest attempt to try and square Islam with modern temperaments and
No, I don't. I really don't. I think he was working with Douglas Murray in Social Cohesion Society or
Centre for Social Cohesion
Institute or whatever.
So, yeah.
Was he working with them? I think so.
I'm not sure, but I know that Douglas is involved in that.
Their very presence in that institute inhibited many of the people there because of their Muslim presence. Even now, I'm going to be speaking on the 15th in Washington, and I know there will be Zudi Yaser in the audience and a couple of other.
Who's Zudi Yaser?
He's an American of Syrian origin. He's a doctor. He's standing for.
Oh, I've heard him speak. But sorry, go on. For listeners who don't know, yeah.
He's going to be present. His very presence has made me inhibited. Has made me embarrassed because I say I'm talking about, for example, slavery. And the fact that Islamic slavery was far worse than anything that happened in the West. The Atlantic slave trade, the Islamic slavery, they shipped 17 million, the top figure. Arabs shipped 17 million black Africans to the Middle East, to the Ottoman Empire, to Arabia. And further afield.
Over what period? That was
centuries earlier than anything that started by the Europeans. Starting from before the 7th century when Islam set in, and there was a higher death rate because it involved the castration of young black males, and there was no anesthetic, and thousands died, millions died on the way. So it was gruesome, and abolition movement did not take root in the Islamic world. In the Ottoman Empire, there was firm resistance to it. Whereas it's very much a Western concept, abolition. It was very much a Western Christian initiative. People like William Wilberforce and Henry Thornton and so on. The Quakers especially, but it did not resonate with the Islamic world.
We'll come back to your point about why you feel inhibited from speaking today, but I kind of want to explore this history because I think some listeners and viewers might not really have a very good understanding of Islamic history necessarily, and we can go all the way to Muhammad, and maybe we'll come to that later, but seeing as we're on slavery, it seems to me that post-Muhammad, up until the slave trade and beyond, it's a very bloody history. And if you look at the Islamic wars moving from the Arabian Peninsula and or the Islamic, I guess, colonialist imperial project, all the way to India, where 110 million Mughals, have I got that right, were killed, i.e. the biggest genocide in human history. 110 million Sikhs were killed under the Mughal Empire. Can you paint a bit of a picture that for people who don't necessarily know Islam history?
The traditional dates to start the Islamic Empire began really at the death of the Prophet Muhammad. It was 632 AD after Christ. And it spread very, very quickly to North Africa, then the Byzantine Empire, it was slowly taken over. And then they got as far as Poitiers in France. And they conquered most of Spain and so on. By the time that they overran, there were the Berber dynasties in North Africa. And then they arrived at the gates of India also in the 8th century with Mahmud of Ghazni and so on. And then later on, the Mughals didn't arrive until late 15th century. But soon, they were overrunning most of what used to be the classical world, Rome and Greece and so on.
I made a mistake earlier. It was actually the Hindus as well as the Sikhs. I didn't, in India, but forgive me. So it was the genocide of the Hindus in India. I made a mistake earlier saying it was the Sikhs, but there's a bloody history that doesn't seem that we have either completely forgotten or never really knew about in the West. There's an amnesia or something that's going on that we in denial of it. I wonder even if Muslims today are aware of the bloody conquest of Islam.
The most tolerant Mughal emperor was Emperor Akbar. He actually turned against Islam. He was an apostate emperor. He encouraged Hinduism. He had lots of Hindu wives and so on. He renounced Islam. But he was followed immediately by his grandson, it must have been, I guess, Aurangzeb. I forget the dates now. In the 17th century, he was the most intolerant of all the Mughals. This is following Akbar, who was the most tolerant, to Aurangzeb, who he destroyed. I have lots of statistics for the number of temples, Hindu temples destroyed. This was known as the Furor Islamicus to Indian art historians. Destruction committed by the intolerant Muslims who didn't want anything to do with the idolatry, as they termed it, of the Hindus. So they went around trying to eradicate Hinduism from the subcontinent.
What about then slavery? Coming back to slavery, is there a sense that Islam has dealt with that? You know, in the West, the last few years, the issue of slavery has been brought up, and the part played by the West and the slavery in America, trying to atone for those sins, has become a very important part of the discourse. Is there any such discourse in the Islamic world?
Not at all. Not at all. Not an ounce of self-doubt or self-questioning. There's no self-criticism in Islam. It's considered a taboo subject. The United States, the total number of slaves who came, 12 million were shipped across the Atlantic. Do you know how many came to the United States?
About 200,000-300,000, right?
388,000, exactly.
Well, the problem with that statistic is that by comparison, it's interesting because
right.
we would many people would guess a lot more. But don't forget that there were many millions who were slaved, who were the offspring, progeny of those imported.
Yes.
So it's not quite that simple. Well, maybe that's not the point you were going to make.
If you're talking about reparations, for example, only about how many white people owned slaves? Something like just under 2% of the whites actually owned black slaves. 98% of the whites are asked to pay reparations, and it's another issue, moral dimension to this. But the thing is, Islamic countries have never, ever been asked to pay reparations. And yet the United States, it had only 388,000 shipped over originally. Far more was sent across the Arabian desert. And then the West has poured in more than $400 billion into Africa since, out of a sense of guilt. $400 billion. What happened to them? Still, Africa, south of Sahara, contains some of the poorest countries. Level of education, level of healthcare, and so on. So, I mean, that's not the answer to their problems. Now, more and more African leaders are recognizing that we can't blame everything on slavery in the way that African Americans attribute all their present failures to slavery. Lack of education, lack of, breakup of the marriages and so on. One-parent families, the greater number in African American. But it cannot possibly be attributed to slavery. But in fact, blacks generally, before in the 19th century, there were more black marriages than white ones, in fact.
Thomas Scholl shows that it's bizarrely, what one might think, it's from the civil rights movement later, that the fact that black African American families, there's the breakdown in families. But before then, there's actually quite high marriage rates.
Right.
So, okay, back to the issue of slavery in Islam. Is there no sense of guilt, as you described, because of something to do with the theology? Is slavery permitted in Islam?
Yes, slavery was recognized by the Quran, definitely. Maybe it's encouraged, the manumission or the liberation of slaves is encouraged, but certainly is there. It's accepted. It was accepted. Right up to the 1950s, there were black slaves being even now, in the 21st century, in the Sudan, you can find slave markets.
ISIS treated the Yazidis, take them in as slaves.
Indeed.
So that's in the scripture, you think?
It certainly, it was accepted social practice, I guess. I don't know how much it depends on the theology. I don't know. I really can't remember.
If you are a Muslim, how do you deal with the scripture like that, or scripture about how they treat women, how they treat apostates, how you've previously examined, how can one tackle that difficulty?
Well, exactly. That's what I was saying earlier. Is you can't do it with any real honesty because you if you think that the Quran is the actual literal word of God, then you would have to, somewhere along the line, you have to say it's no longer applicable. Yeah, I know it's the word of God, but that was meant for 8th century, 7th century Arabia. It's no longer applicable to us. It was designed to deal with the situation back then. Is that option available to modern Muslims? Man, people like Khomeini would say no. It's a eternal word of God. It's applicable for always. It is your duty to promulgate these laws in the present.
And it says through the Quran, one must take this literally. It says that throughout the Quran.
Yeah.
So actually, you would argue that Khamenei now, they are intellectually honest.
At least, yes. They've
they are
been
being consistent with
at
the
least.
scripture.
Exactly.
Before going back to your previous point, I just want to ask about the historic Muhammad. So this seems quite fundamental to me. Who was Muhammad? This is something you've written about, The Quest for Historical Muhammad, a famous book that you edited. This is an issue that came up actually in my conversation with Ed Hussein. Now, I'll start with the tricky issue of Muhammad's wives. I brought up the fact that Muhammad is alleged to have had a 6-year-old wife and consummated when she was 9, which is obviously a very difficult or inconvenient issue, inconvenient thing. But he said I was wrong. He said that firstly, that was contested. Secondly, that was the evidence of that was written 90 years later. And there is other evidence that that specific wife was actually older. I'm quite interested by that. And seeing as you've studied it, do you think Ed is right in saying that, or is there more to the story about?
No, that just shows you the kind of dishonesty you get involved in.
What's the truth about that young wife?
One thing is true, that all our knowledge of the lives of Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, are based on literary evidence, which some of it dates more than 300 years after his supposed death. So there are no surviving extant, documents which are contemporaneous with Muhammad,
including the Quran.
Including the Quran. We don't know what the origin of the Quran. In my view, the Quran has very little to do with somebody called Muhammad. But that's another issue.
We'll come back to that.
Come back. So our knowledge, Hussein is right in one sense, that our knowledge of all the his wives, what he did, and so on, are contained in the Hadith. The Hadiths were written over 300 years after his death. So how can but see, somebody like Hussein will argue about the details of his life, but when it becomes inconvenient, he will bring up the idea of lateness of the sources. But if they're late, they're late for everything. I mean, not a single aspect of his life is authentic. It's all made up centuries later, and it's true that in order to sanctify, to justify a current practice, many people invented hadith and then retrojected it to this mythical past to justify present practices. So if you had somebody who was into young girls, he comes up with this story that Muhammad was married to a 9-year-old, or 8-year-old, consummated when she was 9. Well, I forget the detail. And this is true for all these things, like stoning to death for adultery and so on and so on. So either you throw out everything that we know, supposedly that we know about Muhammad, you pick and choose. But then, I mean, why is one story better than the other? And then you come up with this nonsense about the wonderful memories. You have to invent how the Arabs had this fantastic memory and they could remember things over 200 years. And they passed down this tradition. You had this long list of chain of authorities. In fact, if you look at all the hadith, they're incredibly childish. You have a story of a bunch of men, soldiers, sitting around a campfire. And he says, I remember the Prophet saying to me once that one mustn't use a toothpick after eating something.
The first time I sat down to read the hadith, I think maybe the third passage was about farting. It's about when it was appropriate to fart and not fart.
Right.
So, yeah.
How anybody can take any of this nonsense seriously, and that Western scholars, historians, have accepted it for all these years. It's just unbelievable. It's unbelievable how they've been uncritical in their look at the sources for our knowledge of early Islam. So that's why I think we don't know where this book called the Quran actually comes from. We really don't. The stories of it's been passed down through oral tradition, and that it is just nonsense, a complete nonsense.
So where the moderate Muslims, though, might be right is that you don't necessarily have to take it literally, because we don't know what's true and what's literal.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so actually is there not room for hope there that given that we don't know, then you could say there's legitimate reasons that you can edit out or change things?
Yeah, I agree.
Because you could
but
challenge
you would
the
have to
legitimacy
then
of the sources.
say that our knowledge of the Quran, where it came from, is pretty shaky.
What do we know anything at all that we can say? Do you agree that there was a man called Muhammad in the Arabian desert?
No, I'm not certain that there was somebody called Muhammad. No, it is very, very much rather a coincidence. This name, which means the praised one, that he should have had this name. It's just not. It's just not credible. I think what happened is a bit like Robin Hood. Okay. The traditional story of Robin Hood, as seen in the movies of Errol Flynn or somebody, Little John, Friar Tuck, of the minstrel, forgot his name. These are obviously literary creations. There may have been some rebel, was it 12th century, 11th century, I forget. Robin Hood is 11th, it's time of the Crusades, 10th, 11th century. There may have been somebody in 11th century who occasionally attacked rich merchants or somebody. But the rest of the story that we know, which has been passed down to us, is literary creation.
A better analogy might be King Arthur, because
that's another one.
King Arthur, we don't know that there's no evidence that it existed, but it's possible that there was someone fighting the Anglo-Saxons coming over some sort of Britain, and he is the foundational myth in some ways of England's national myth.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so Muhammad, you don't accept that there's necessarily a real Muhammad, but what happened immediately after Muhammad suggests that there was some sort of inspiration, because straight away you have this conquest from that region that spreads out across the world, as you described earlier. So something happened that inspired that.
I wouldn't know how to characterize that. Did they consciously create a myth. I don't know. I really don't know.
As well as speaking to Ed Hussein, I spoke to Ayan Hirsi Ali, our mutual friend, and her take on it is that there was Muhammad at the time of Mecca, a peaceful man trying to spread some good messages, and this ties in with Ed's version, is that after a period of time his message wasn't getting anywhere, so you get the Medina version of Muhammad, who is a fighter, a warmonger, and with the Medina version of Muhammad, we have associated all the parts of the Quran which are far more anti-Semitic, far more brutal. Do you accept any of that narrative?
No, not
What's wrong with that narrative?
None of it makes any sense.
Tell me why Ayan and Ed are both wrong then.
This is based on the traditional picture. The notion of Mecca and Medina is already a literary construct made by the apologists of Islam. There's no evidence that Islam started in Mecca. Absolutely none whatsoever. It's all based on literary sources 200 years afterwards, including the Mecca and Medina business. Really, now, even on their own account, it doesn't make sense, because even if you accept this traditional picture of Mecca and Medina, it's in fact so early and later, early Mecca, later Medina. In fact, the so-called verses of the sword, some of them, in fact, are early. They're not later.
How do you know they're earlier?
Well, exactly. This is another. Exactly. How would you decide? Okay. The whole thing is nonsense. That's why I've been working. I'm one of the founding members, really, of a group of basically French, German, Belgian scholars who created a group called the Inara group. Inara means enlightenment in Arabic. And they've been the only group which has been critical of the sources, critical of the traditional picture. And they've been chipping away at the traditional picture since 2007, I think. So nearly 25 years. And one of the things they established, if the language of Arabic had I'll get this argument right. If it had been born in Mecca, it would have been more natural for them to write that language using South Arabia, an American who lived and worked in fact, he lived not far from where I ended up in southwest France. John Wansbrough, he said that people started fabricating so-called pre-Islamic poetry. But this was all invented to give the Arabic language a venerable antiquity. They would invent it in the 8th century and then reject it on its past. But there's no way that this poetry reflects anything to do with pre-Islamic Arabia, because our knowledge of pre-Islamic Arabia, again, is based on very late sources. There's no way of getting around the lack of sources, written sources.
So yeah, the message I'm getting is that there's no real evidence for it. Another thing that's curious about the Quran is that there's a lot of pieces of Jewish and Christian history, or rather more specifically, stories from the scripture of Jewish and Christian scripture. And this is actually something that the historian Tom Holland wrote about, in that it's almost like, I think it's, he wrote a history doing the historical, what we know historically about the Jews, the Christians, and Islam, the foundations of those religions. And he said, if you read the Quran, and I sort of agree with this, it's almost like someone's misremembered aspects of Jewish and Christian scripture.
He got all that from me, by the way.
Oh, he plagiarized you?
Yeah. he was... that's another one. I won't go into that.
No, go on.
But he picked my brains. We spent hours together, and I sent
you and
him...
Tom Holland, yeah.
In London. And I sent him so many articles, so many he'd never heard of, books he had never heard of. Since he doesn't know German, I had to find translators for the German scholarship on him. And then he wrote, based a lot on my sources there, my early anthology there. And then I asked him, why did you not thank me? He said, I forgot.
Tom Holland, if you're listening, I think you owe Mr. Warraq a thank you.
He said he would correct that in future editions, but I don't think he ever did. I never looked at any later editions. I couldn't be bothered.
Did you read his book?
No, I haven't actually read it. In the Shadow of the Sword.
That's correct, yeah. Okay. Okay, so that's where he comes from you, really. This is the book you need to go to if you want to. Can we go back to your point earlier? So you're here in DC now, and you have said you're speaking at a conference in, sorry, we're not in DC, we're in New York, but you're going to DC. You're speaking at a conference of Iron, and there are other Muslims present, and their presence makes you feel inhibited to speak truthfully. Why are you inhibited by their presence?
Bad manners. I feel a bit embarrassed, but...
Or the opposite, good manners. You're too mannered to speak how you feel or what you think.
Yeah, I'm too... I suppose I don't want to hurt anybody's sensibilities. I'm not going to censor myself. I'm going to speak exactly what I wrote down, in fact. And we'll see how it goes. We'll see how they react to it. There's some women there even some women who with their hijab. Why she's been invited, I don't know. Anyway.
Do you think Islam can be reformed?
No, I don't think so.
You don't.
I think that people, in my last book on atheism and free thought in Islam, it's called Losing the Allah delusion. Leaving the Allah delusion behind. I show that there is an incredible rise in ex-Muslims around the Islamic world, but people, of course, still incredibly frightened of mentioning it in public because of obvious reasons. Danger to the family, fear of social ostracism, and not wishing to upset the parents, family members, and so on. But it's an enormous, it's a huge movement. It's an absolutely huge movement. It's not just a few people here and there. It's now a real tsunami. You express.
Of Muslim apostates?
Yeah.
Where I don't see that. Where is that happening?
It's online. It's online. It has to be for various political and social reasons.
Across the world, across the West?
No, across the Islamic world. You'd have to look at my book, and then it's called "Leaving the Allah Delusion Behind."
So since October 7th, one would be forgiven for getting quite a different impression because, as we've seen, I'm from London. Almost, not every weekend, but many weekends since October 7th, we have mass protests. It's not just Muslim groups, but it's also, there's, I guess, leftist, white British groups, but there's a lot of Muslim groups. We've already talked about what British Muslims think about October 7th in this conversation. And at time of speaking, last night was the Eurovision contest in Malmo, Sweden, which is now 1/5, I think, either Muslim or immigrant population. Tens of thousands of protesters outside of the stadium where the Israeli singer was singing. Inside the arena, while she was singing, you can see footage where everyone's booing and hissing her. We're seeing this across Europe. It actually looks like quite a different story, that actually Muslims are very confident. They have a very different worldview to Westerners. And we have an issue of assimilation and integration with these two groups living beside each other. And you live in France. We've seen a lot of that in France. We've seen a lot of the Islamist attacks. So you say, on the one hand, there's a tsunami of apostates, but that doesn't really look like it if you follow the news.
No, because the reason I say people are scared of revealing that.
But it's not just about scared, because they're taking the streets in the name of their faith.
I'd had to put a figure on this. I don't know how many in terms of numbers. I've no idea. But I think you will get a different picture from what you describe if you read my testimonies of people who left. The number of people who are no longer afraid to speak up. But it's still a minority who speak up. But I think the actual number of who actually are is greater. I have no way of proving all that.
What do you make of what you've seen in Europe since October 7th? What's your impression of the protests?
Yeah, I find it very, very frightening, very disappointing. The politicians haven't been firm enough. They have not stood up against this barbarity. But I'm a little bit isolated where I am.
Given your personal story is one of coming to England and really feeling like an Englishman before feeling rejected by others, so your life is one where you've contested with the issues of integration. It almost felt like you were rejected. You felt rejected at some point. But given the huge demographic changes in Europe through mass migration, this is a question I think we really need to address. We really need to talk about. Politicians need to talk about it for social cohesion, if nothing else. I wondered if you had insight, not only on a personal level, on a societal level, and how we should approach these two worldviews of people living side by side.
I think it won't help if you pretend that the situation isn't what it is. You must speak up, and there should be zero tolerance of imams, religious leaders in the Islamic world in Europe who spout hatred of Jews, of the West generally. Nobody wants to speak up. I give examples in my, I forget, there are all sorts of complacent, especially left-wing, this is a left-wing phenomenon. What I was going to say my friend, I've never actually met him, writer called Michel Onfray. He wrote a book called The Art of Being French, in French. And he has a chapter which I translated and had published on Jihad Watch. It's called Islamo-Gauchism.
Oh, yes.
I don't know whether you saw that. But it's a very much left-wing defense, basically, of Islamic barbarism, the refusal to criticize any aspect of Islam whatsoever. It's just unbelievable what they should read this article, that I've translated. It's quite frightening. These are how they're totally inconsistent. Well, how can you expect a Moroccan Muslim to integrate into a society which has been taught is in corrupt and filth and it's sinking? Who wants to integrate into a sinking ship? The left wingers have been teaching the West, and this has got to stop. This is so you've got to put up as defense in the way that I will try and do on Wednesday.
Yeah, so this is what your speech is going to be about.
Yes, defending the West and how what the it's based on exaggeration and complete fabrication of numbers and figures. Like Ward Churchill, who was at the University of Colorado, who actually was thrown out for for fraud. He said something like 32 million. I'll have to look at my notes. I can't remember the figures, but he plucks out of the air. It's all in his book. So many million Indians and indigenous people were massacred by the Europeans, whereas in fact, for example, there's a website which says that 7 million, funded by the U.S. government, 7 million Taino Indians on Hispaniola, the island that Columbus landed on, 7 million were exterminated. The total population of this island was 250,000. How could this is the kind of exaggeration.
In North America, the estimates now is 10 million were killed of indigenous Americans.
Yeah.
But something like 90% of that, 95%, was from disease that went ahead of the people, before the people even... Horrendous, obviously, but we don't get the right picture of what actually happened.
In fact, there was a series of articles in The Spectator. Did you read those in the London version by Finn Paul?
I didn't see it.
Jeff Finn, and I rely a lot on his book for. Unfortunately, it's frustrating. He doesn't give the proper references. I wrote to him about it, and he was very blasé about it. But anyway,
So you like your references? You check everything, and
I have to. I can't rely on
a real historian.
If somebody says so, I have to check that this is in fact.
If only everyone was like that. That's a good way to be. So you're going to talk about the threat to the West, and part of that is that an undermining of Western history. We talked earlier about slavery. You're mentioning now a rewriting of history that's gone on, and the founding of America and what really happened there. We've talked about Islam, although that's perhaps more of a European issue at the moment rather than it is North American. What are the other threats to the West that you see?
It's the clue to everything. It undermines the confidence of ordinary Americans to hold their head up high. If they've been told that your ancestor this and this and that, when it's not in fact true, it's bound to undermine confidence in your own civilization. I think just setting the record straight alone would count for something. But it's amazing how, if you have a mindset which is already predisposed to believe in your own iniquity and degradation, then you will accept anything that's said. They say yes, please please beat us a bit more, and
That certainly seems like one of the other things. It's a loss of confidence in in
civilizational self-confidence.
Civilization,
is what we need to get back,
which is very concerning. On a personal level, if you forgive me, and this is I perhaps pry, but your life seems to be one of tremendous courage. You not only risked physical danger from the wider Muslim community, but you've also explained how it has split up your family a little bit. Where do you think that courage comes from? Why do you care so much about the pursuit of truth? You also describe wanting to check every bit of detail in history, check all these facts. Where does that motivation, where's the drive from?
If you no longer believe in God, I think, and then truth becomes your yardstick. It becomes really important for you to establish what really is the truth. I've sometimes, as I said earlier, I sometimes compromise myself. I back down. I don't speak up when I should have spoken up. I feel I haven't been courageous enough, really, not unlike Ayan, who's been very courageous on every occasion. I've been quiet when I should have spoken up.
What held you back?
It's complicated. There was a moment when I wanted to be my more technical research to be taken seriously. And for that to happen, I had to make sure that I'm not considered a bigot or an Islamophobe or whatever. So I had to stay neutral so that I can actually make the point about what really happened and so on.
That seems like a good thing then. It's a considered approach because you have a greater objective, which is to be the historian that you want to be and to examine this seriously. It doesn't really seem like anything at all to regret.
I'm a bit muscle-bound, and I think I was asked to speak at the Oxford Union about whether Islam was religion of peace or not. This is before I'd actually written this book, The Islam and Islamic Terrorism. It was long before. This is several years ago I was invited. And one of the reasons I turned it down was that I hadn't done all this research. I just hadn't written. I mean, I knew roughly, but I wanted to be really, really watertight. I wanted all my arguments to be soundproof. So I just wish I'd been a bit more courageous at certain times.
You say that once you give up God, truth becomes the new yardstick. I'm sure you must have seen Ayan Hirsi Ali's recent conversion, her move away from atheism to Christianity. I wonder what you made of that.
Well, I don't know. I can't really question her motives, but I personally also, Richard Dawkins, in fact, would agree with me on this. Both Richard Dawkins and I think that if you attack Christianity, and people will start converting to Islam.
Well, actually, this is it's more than that, right? So you say when you have no God, truth becomes a new yardstick. We're talking about the West. I would say the new atheists like Dawkins have been incredibly successful in killing God over the last 50 years. And the consequence has been that there's a whole bunch of quasi-pseudo-religions like wokeism, like environmentalism, that have taken the place. And this is something Ayan quoting Chesterton, if you don't believe in anything, if you don't believe in something, you'll believe in anything. And so you've chosen the truth, but there's plenty of others in the absence of God who aren't choosing truth. They're choosing a new system of life.
It's the same mentality, They accept any nonsense. The lacking in critical thought, the critical thinking. What is your evidence for any opinion that you express, whether it's a literary one or whether it's your preference for a certain opera or some poem? You always ask the question, what is your proof? What is the evidence? Well, you give your reasons for liking certain poetry and certain dramas and certain musical styles and so on. So this is, you give the evidence for your opinion. So you've got to have a critical spirit.
But given how costly the pursuit of truth has been in your life, actually, there's a compelling argument to say that maybe pursuing the truth isn't always smart, and sometimes pursuing what's nice to stick in, to fit in a community, there's value to that as well. And maybe that's...
I would like to be a bit more popular than I am. But it's just not going to happen. One of my former girlfriends, her one big desire in life was to be liked by everyone. Unbelievable. Anything to be liked, and it's not what I...
Yeah, that can be difficult. Why was that bad for you? Does that mean the truth was...
Yeah, then just... why should you want to be liked by fascists and who...
It's a very good point. Well, that's precisely how those ideologies become so successful, is because people care more about fitting in and being part of a group and community and performing than standing out and risking shame, risking even their lives, if we're talking about the fascists.
Incidentally, one other argument that sometimes people come up with is that you're no longer a Muslim, so you can't criticize Islam. You have to be a fascist to be able to criticize fascism.
Well, that's a fun, positive note to end on. Is there anything else that you'd like to discuss that you feel like we didn't touch on that is important to the audience to hear and to know?
No, I think I've lost my voice.
Well, it's a great pleasure to speak with you. Finally, I think was that 2018 that we first met? I think it was. So 6 years ago.
Really?
That I was hoping to do this, and we've managed to finally do it. Thank you.
Okay.
People who have not read your books, not this one, but and I actually have your other book, Why I'm Not a Muslim. It's in London. I don't have it with me. Where's a place for people to start? Where do you think is the best entry point into your work?
I think Why I'm Not a Muslim is probably followed by probably this one, and then my collection of essays, Virgins, What Virgins.
Fantastic. Well, on that note, Ibn Warraq, a pleasure, a privilege to speak with you.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this show. I am your host, Apostasy, joined today by a dear friend of the channel, Alim, Secular Spirit. And today we'll be reacting to a video by Yaser Qadhi. Well, the original video is by Yaser Qadhi, a Muslim apologist and da'wah person, meaning a proselytizer, who is talking about why Muslims leave Islam. And then that video was animated and made into a shorter version, which is what we're going to be watching together today. So, Alim, why are we watching this video? Because this was your idea.
It was my idea. Thank you so much for having me on the channel, and it's good to see you back in action. And yeah, I mean, we did cover something that Yaser Qadhi did last summer, I believe. It was part of your Dissecting Apologetics series. If you remember, like the top 10 most common controversial questions. Do we have free will? Should Muslims participate in politics? That was really my first experience of him. And what I thought was so interesting about Yaser Qadhi was he is more coherent than a lot of these kinds of people. I don't know if you want to call them a proselytizer, apologist, or whatever. And yet I can see the fatal flaws in his thinking, because this is going to kind of summarize the entire video that we're going to do. Is he just has this assumption that Islam has to be true And the video that I found, and I had it saved for like a long time, I think really encapsulates in 6 minutes exactly what the problem is when trying to converse with Muslims about why you left. There's like a very key fundamental block, and this captures it perfectly. And so I hope we can set the record straight if Muslims are watching this, or Yaser Qadhi ever watches it.
Yeah, I haven't watched the video yet. This was suggested by you, and I intentionally didn't watch it because I wanted to.
You're going in blind.
Yeah. I have watched a lot of stuff by Yaser Qadhi in the past, and I have a vague idea of where he's going to take this, but I'm going to try to not have any biases going into this.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to listen to what he's saying. Not if he said something outrageous in the past that ties into it, I will bring it up. But I have a very bad memory, so I'm mostly going to be reacting to this. So yeah, I'm excited. Let's see where this takes us. This is what a lot of Muslims and their leaders think of, their faith leaders think of why people like us left Islam. Cool intro.
Can you pause for me to make my first comment? I don't know if anyone else listens to these things on YouTube. I have trouble sleeping, so I listen to a lot of ambient noise stuff, and I'm pretty sure that's like the Buddhist Tibetan meditation Zen noises that you can find on YouTube. Interesting choice for is a Muslim video.
That is ironic, I would say. Yeah. And one more thing I want to comment on, in this animation, you see boys and girls sitting in the same class. I mean, maybe that happens more in Western countries, but that absolutely does not happen.
It could have just been the animation template and they couldn't change it.
Yeah, that could be it. But I just wanted to point out that I don't think this was an intentional choice to mislead people or anything, but this is already painting a rosy picture of how it is. Usually there's a lot more gender segregation than that.
Also, if we want to dissect it further, there's only cats there because dogs are dirty. Because I don't know if people know that's like a Muslim thing.
Yeah. All right. And I can talk about the word iqra, but anyway, let's get into the video.
Islam does not come with anything that is irrational, but it does come with things that are supra-rational, i.e. rationality does not. And
what's crazy is I reacted to this before. Damn it, I already know. All right. What do
you remember it, eh?
Yeah. What do you want to say?
Well, the thing is, okay, so first thing to mention is that this is an excerpt from a longer lecture that he did, I think around 10 years ago, that another channel animated. But I love how it just starts with this claim that there's nothing irrational in Islam. If this is your starting off point, then you're gonna end up in trouble, and we're gonna see why very, very shortly.
Yeah, and okay, let's just watch.
Cannot have a role to judge whether it's valid or not. It's beyond.
Say that again.
Things that are supra-rational, i.e. rationality does not and cannot have a role to judge whether it's valid or not. It's beyond the scope of the intellect.
Okay, that's already gatekeeping. He's saying it's beyond reason, so you cannot use reason when it comes to religion.
But there's nothing that is irrational at the same time.
He just created a new category of rationality that is, it's irrational, but it is because it's above rationality, not because it doesn't agree with rationality.
I actually don't think that's what he's saying. It's our rationality is too limited. It is rational, just it's beyond the scope of our intellect, as he was saying.
Judge whether it's valid or not. It's beyond the scope of the intellect.
Yes.
Islam does not come with anything that contradicts the intellect, but it comes with things that the intellect might not necessarily understand, even if it does not find illogical. Islam will tell you these things, and it is possible your mind will not fully comprehend, but Islam will never tell you something that goes against, that contradicts the mind that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed you with.
But what does this actually mean? So like, let's take one very simple example that, I mean, free will and predestination is not a simple example. Let's take a simpler one. If I observe that Muhammad invented a rule, or conveniently God gave him a rule to be able to marry a woman that he desires that belonged to his adopted son or was the wife of his adopted son. So then the rule outlawed adoption and said, hey, you can marry this woman now. I would say rationally, that seems very in line with what other cult leaders do. And the supra-rational explanation is that, no, it's not suspicious because God said so. I don't know if that follows. I feel like rationally you would assume that it is like every other situation where a cult leader makes up a rule.
I think it's one of those things where conceptually you can kind of see where it's coming from. And I do remember being taught this stuff as a Muslim, that there's these things that you're going to see, they're not going to make sense. And to even use like a more crude, basic example, all the suffering we see in the world. Why are newborn babies dying of horrible genetic defects or things like that? It doesn't seem to make sense. But then you just trust that Allah knows what he's doing, and that it is not, it doesn't interfere with the justice and mercy and love that he has for all of us.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, let's just keep listening.
And when you look at the questions that these young men and women, 17, 18, 19, 20, up to the early 20s, they inevitably center around a core group of issues, all of which are modern, all of which are emanating from within a particular cultural paradigm. In other words, the questions that people of our generation are asking never even occurred to the last generation or the generation before them.
Okay, all right. I have to stop him right there. I think this is BS. Like my question about free will and predestination, which was one of the things that got me out of this belief. It's not about the West feeding me ideas about free will and predestination not going together. And it's not a question that didn't occur to people before me. So he's blanket just saying, hey, any problems that young Muslims see today with Islam are because they're basically fed ideas by their culture that's surrounding them, especially he means to say the West. And it's, guys, you're committing the fallacy of presentism. This is just because now you have a modern understanding of things. And the word that he's not saying here is that I think he's talking about the prophet marrying a child, for example. He's saying now people think it's bad for a prophet to marry a child. But a long time ago, people didn't think that way. So it's unfair to judge Muhammad based on today's standards.
Well, the thing I would also add, I think he does specify a few examples in a little bit. The thing is, some of those questions have been asked for countless generations. Like the key one that I think got me questioning as a Muslim is, how do I even know that Islam is true? And this is definitely something that Muslims have pondered ever since Islam was a thing.
Yeah, that's the biggest question. The one thing that, when I was done with all the digging and everything, the question is, what proves Islam to be true? And the answer is nothing. There's nothing that proves Islam specifically to be true. There's a lot of arguments about how could the universe exist without a creator and all that kind of stuff. There's nothing that proves Islam specifically to be true. And I don't think that's a new concept, or that's a concept that was given to us by our environment.
Or the generation before them, all the way back to the Prophet ﷺ and before. These are questions that modern society is positing. Questions about the existence of God, sexuality and orientation, gender roles.
Wait, hold up. The question of the existence of God, he thinks that's a modern question?
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't make sense. The gender role question, you could maybe argue that this is something that is more recently more of a big cultural debate that's in the forefront in the past couple of decades, but not the existence of God. And I would say, when it comes to questioning Muslims, it's really, that's the big one, isn't it? Does this God even exist?
I think that's one of the major ones. And I mean, what was I going to say? The gender roles and sexuality and that kind of stuff, the fact that the question is a more recent one doesn't automatically mean that it's not a good question to ask. It just didn't occur to people before, or they didn't know better. So his way of dismissing it doesn't make sense still. But the existence of God question, I think maybe this is kind of what he means here. Back in the day when Muhammad was positing his religion, or anyone was pitching a religion, people already sort of believed in gods and spirits and the metaphysical and things of that nature. So it wasn't out of the realm of questioning to say, hey, I know a truth about God. And they're like, what is God? I mean, they wouldn't ask, what is God? This is a weird concept. They're like, okay, I believe in God. What do you have to say? But now people have answers for things that we used to ascribe gods for, like the angel of rain or the god of rain or whatever it may be. Now we understand how rain happens, and we can manipulate the rain, and we can see the effects of global warming on the rain and things of that nature. We don't have a gap to fill with God. So now we're still asking, wait, so where does God come in? God is just an invisible layer behind all of this, that if you take God out of the equation still makes sense. So now people are asking more about the existence of God, but it's not a novel question.
No, yeah, even though I do agree with you, like the majority of people had some kind of belief in God, some kind of concept of God, those questions about, are we actually believing anything, has likely always existed.
Yeah.
These things did not exist. Society, by and large, accepted these things as truths. And 100 years.
Okay, and society by and large accepted that if you started shouting and acting weird, you were possessed by a devil. And now we know that there's things, related to mental health and physiological reasons, problems with your brain, with your neurology that could cause these things. So just because people have always thought a certain way doesn't mean that they've been right the whole time. We didn't have modern medicine until a few hundred years ago. Does that mean that modern medicine ideas are incorrect because people have never questioned medicine before, or have never questioned health that way? It's such a silly objection. And keep in mind that in this video, the title is, "Why do Muslims leave Islam?" He's already on the defensive before saying anything about the reasons that Muslims give.
No, we still don't know it yet. No.
Yeah. He's just like, the reasons ex-Muslims give. He's just like, Islam is perfect. If there's something you don't understand, that's a you problem. If something's not rational, it's not irrational. It is above your reasoning, and all your questions are new anyway, and they don't count.
Well, the thing that's tied to it too is you can see the common Muslim bias here in mentioning things like gender roles and sexual orientation, because there is this prejudice amongst a lot of Muslims that, the people who leave Islam, they're leaving because they've been infected by Western LGBTQ propaganda, or because they're exploring sexuality in a deviant way and they're trying to justify it for themselves, so they feel like they're still good. So it's definitely addressed to a Muslim audience, and someone who isn't Muslim wouldn't understand that, but that's definitely what he's doing here.
Yeah, he doesn't need to spell it out for Muslims, but he needs to say, there's a secret agenda of gay people and generals being shifted, and that's why people are leaving, not because there are valid questions and there've always been valid questions.
Years from now, the questions that then those generations of Muslims will be asking will be completely unknown of, unthought of by the generations of our time.
How could you know that? How could you know that?
He says it so confidently, but let's assume that is correct. Let's assume that, in a generation or two, there will be questions that we didn't fathom yet. Does that mean that those questions should be dismissed? I mean, knowledge is cumulative, right? And if we say a kid 300 years ago would have never asked, what is an electron? Because there was no concept of an electron. But because now they learned it in school, they can ask the question, what is an electron? How come I don't get electrocuted when I touch my cat? And things like that. But so people in the future are going to have questions that we didn't think about, because they don't have to start from the level of not having any knowledge and build up on that. They start with the shortcuts that the people before them already gave them. So it's not a bad thing.
Well, you're committing the common fault of a lot of people in the West, Aladdin, because you assume that human history is just this trajectory of progress and improvement, but we have had the truth of Islam and the right way to live for hundreds and hundreds of years, and we've departed from that. We've distorted from that.
Mm-hmm.
So we've actually degraded in our understanding. We've corrupted ourselves. And this is what you'll hear from some Muslims, because I think the way some of them view history is, well, we have these answers, these fundamental core truths that will never change. And this is why you see this appeal to tradition or to the past, because we've departed from those things, we've lost them, and we have to return to them.
Someone was asking to see my cat. It's right here. One of them is right here.
The clingy one, yeah.
Yeah. There are a few questions that we're getting in the chat, but we'll address them after the video.
Instead of being so quick to question Islam, take a step back and be just as questioning of your own questions and where they're emanating from.
Okay. I have to pause here because I just published a video like a day ago where I had this specific part of a clip in mind. SubhanAllah, I didn't even know that I was going to do this, but this is exactly the quote that I was referencing, how these religious preachers will ask you to question yourself before you question God. And I'm not saying you should never question yourself. You should have self-reflection. You should make
I actually think that's a good point that he's making.
But he's saying he's not saying you should question yourself before you question Allah only. He's saying you should never question Allah. You should just be stuck questioning yourself. So how much questioning myself do I need to do to qualify to question Allah? None. Like there's no amount that he would be satisfied with, that he would think, you know what, you've been thinking about this for years. You now have the authority to question Allah, or you now have, and it's not even question Allah, question the story that is written about Allah.
Yeah, because if you go to the beginning of the video, it's right there. The bias is right there. There is nothing in Islam that is irrational. So you have to figure out some way of making your doubts, your concerns, your questions fit with keeping Islam to be the truth, because there is no other alternative that is acceptable to Muslims. So you're kind of trapped there. And I do like it. Like, I think generally speaking, we should be questioning our context and where our questions are coming from and how our biases might be affecting how we're viewing things. But the thing that people like Yaser Qadhi don't do is they don't take it that step further to actually look at the Quran without their bias of belief.
And he's saying that's something that I want to highlight. Two things. When people say question Allah, and I've spoken about this in videos before, I am not a human saying I know more than the God of the universe, the God that created everything, that knows everything. I am saying the story about the God of the universe sounds fishy. I get to question that story. You don't get to just say the story is unquestionable because I claim that it came from the unquestionable God. Had we proven that God said something, then I have no choice but to say, you know what, even though it doesn't make sense to me, what am I going to do? I have to accept that he has some understanding of it that I don't, but we haven't proven that. We're struggling to have faith, or the questioning Muslims are struggling to have faith, because how do you work off of the assumption that this is from God? You know, it's like a circular logic. So to accept that the nonsensical answers and explanations make sense, you have to accept that they're from God. But if you don't accept that they're from God, then they're nonsensical answers. Yeah. And the second thing I want to highlight is he's saying, just listen to this quote.
And be just as questioning of your own questions and where they're emanating from.
This is implied here is where they're emanating from. Your questioning is emanating from a bad source. He's invalidating the question rather than addressing it. He's saying, if a question seems like it's putting Islam in trouble, it's because the question is bad. It's not because there's an answer.
From the modern cultural paradigm.
Yeah. He's saying your questions are emanating from a bad place either. And some people go as far as to believe that these questions were planted. You know, there's a conspiracy that there are people spreading these questions to trick people out of Islam. But if it's truly the truth, then no question will be a trick question. No question Islam cannot answer with certainty and clarity, to the point that even the so-called hater, you know, even if someone has bad intentions or their questions are emanating from the wrong place, they have no choice but to say, you know what, that makes sense. Egg to my face. I have no choice but to accept your answer. But that's not what happens. They're discrediting any person who doesn't accept their nonsensical questions, as to say, subconsciously or consciously, it's coming from a bad place.
Instead of just jumping at the Quran and saying, why does the Quran say this? Take a step back before you get there and ask yourself, why am I asking this particular question and not another one that perhaps 500 or 1,000 years ago was at the forefront of people?
Why can't I ask both questions? I mean,
exactly.
Yeah.
If Islam is true, why have all
we live in? We also should be brave. We also should be brave enough to challenge those questions.
Okay.
You know what's so funny about this is that you could address this to Muslims who are questioning Islam. We're being spoon-fed this by a specific context, and the Quran and Islam are tied to a specific civilization, time period, code of conduct, and all that. But no, because Islam is true, so that's
you can't
inarguable.
question the truth. And he says spoon-fed to us. You know who's doing the spoon-feeding right now? Like, he's spoon-feeding people answers, and if they don't make sense to them, he's spoon-feeding them rationalizations for how they should be questioning themselves and questioning the source of questions and questioning every supra-rational.
Why are we not brave enough to challenge those questions, even as we're brave enough to challenge the Quran?
Wait, hold up. That's an accusation that is not true.
We live in, we also should be brave enough to challenge those questions. Why are we not brave enough to challenge those questions, even as we're brave enough to challenge the Quran?
We should have a bingo card for how many fallacies he commits, because this one is the whataboutism fallacy. So how come you question the Quran and you don't question the society that you live in? But it's also false, because I do question the society that I live in. I don't know about you. Like, do you adhere strictly to what everyone else around you does and says?
Of course not. No, nobody really does, to be honest.
And this is the same kind of straw man whataboutism as, how come you're not discussing another religion right now? How come you're questioning Islam and you're not criticizing, or how come you're criticizing Islam and not Christianity? No one's talking about these other things. There are other channels, there are other forums that do discuss these things. And I'm not one who supports them wholeheartedly and says any policy that the country that I live in implements, or that the society that around me practices, therefore that I can't question that, but I should question Quran. No, we're questioning both, and only one of those two throws a fit when you question it.
Right? Well, that's your point, like the defensiveness of it too, of well, we're so quick to attack the Quran, jump on the Quran. I don't think that really resonates with how vaulted and how highly vaunted the Quran is in people's day-to-day lives in society. If anything, it's something that is rarely questioned and truly challenged within the Muslim community.
Yeah.
Those questions will change. The Quran will remain, as we know, unchanged.
And that's part of the problem, isn't it?
Well, I don't know, like maybe you have a different point from me about this, but I'm so tired of this whole the Quran will never change thing is unchanged, because what Muslims are trying to do is they're trying to say that their religion is kind of exempt from the evolving understanding of society, from the evolving morality of society, how things change, when we can see how Islam has changed over the centuries, when we see the differing attitudes to things like sex slavery, for example. I don't know if you ever noticed how, if you look at different translations of the Quran into English, before they might have, the term that your right hand owns, or they might actually just say slave girl. But in the more recent, there's one more recent translation where they call those women bond women, because a bondwoman is not a slave. But then the funny thing is, you go into the tafsir, the explanation, that's probably older, and it still calls them slave girls.
Yeah. And it's so slimy of Yaser Qadhi, because he would say that Islam evolves with, to give an example, say that there's an area of conflict where a Muslim population is being taken over by believers of another religion, and they start taking Muslim slaves, and they start separating families and taking them as slaves, as concubines, whatever. He would say that is so inhumane, that is so bad, I hate that. But if it's done in the name of Allah in a particular context and blah, 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 then it's fine. So it can't be all unchanging and stands the test of time. And at the same time, you get what I'm trying to say?
Well said, yeah. I mean, that's the point that I was trying to make, that they're trying to act as if they're exempt from, because they'll criticize non-religious cultural value society as, well, it's always changing, and the things that you consider moral, they might not be considered moral, it's not objective, when in reality a religion like Islam, it isn't objective either. It's constantly evolving, because what we really have is just the interpretation of that religion, and that is constantly changing, and it constantly varies depending on where it's practiced and by who.
Yeah. By the way, there are some commenters who are trying to spread Jesus in the chat. Please shut up about Jesus. Like, I don't know if this needs to be said.
Hi, Jesus is God. I recognize them from my channel.
And this is funny. Christina says the demons in the chat are in the chat. Pray for them. Demons aren't real. I mean, you can pray if you want, but I just want you to know that we understand demons aren't real. It's sometimes annoying when Christians jump on this opportunity to be like, oh, right, I agree with you. That is evidence that it's a satanic, demonic cult. I'm like, no, you're halfway there. The criticisms that we're applying to Islam here often apply to Christianity as well. I feel
like we do have to change some wording, but if we wanted to flip the script, adapt the script for Christianity, we wouldn't have to change that many words. We could even have the sex slavery discussion or the slavery discussion about the Bible. Yeah, they're not actually slaves. They're not the chattel slavery that we know today, and they're it's indentured servitude. Indentured servitude, bond woman, bond man. It's the same kind of word gymnastics.
And whenever I make a video, not even talking, specifics, just talking about my experience with faith and the answers that I got and what is expected of you, so many ex-Christians in the comments say, hey, you didn't say Christianity explicitly, or you did mention Christianity, but if you switch a few terms here and there, this is exactly what I went through.
I hear that too, time and time again.
Yeah. All right.
Theologian Ibn Taymiyyah, the Quran will remain, as we know, unchanged. This great theologian Ibn Taymiyyah, he actually critiques this notion that reason alone will always arrive at the truth. And he brings forth such beautiful examples. First and foremost, the impossibility of even defining what is reason, what is rational, what is intellectual. What might be intellectual for us was not intellectual a generation ago. What might be rational for us was not rational 100 years ago. Rationality itself changes from society to time to place. And there is nothing that we can judge rationality by in and of itself. In fact...
Okay, before he continues, this is such a distraction. Like I hate
okay, we've reached the halfway point. Try to look at this as objectively as possible, not as an ex-Muslim. Based on what you've seen so far, why do Muslims leave Islam?
He didn't even really talk about that yet. He's just saying you can't question. You should question yourself. Don't question Islam. There are things beyond rationality. Blah blah blah.
You can't even trust reason.
You can't use reason. So don't you dare say God says Iqra. Remember what I said? I will comment about the word Iqra. That was in the Iqra is the first word that Jibril allegedly said to Muhammad, which means read. Or Muslims take it to mean learn, or God is encouraging learning and thinking. And do they not think? Do they not reason? All that stuff in the Quran they point to say Islam isn't asking you just for blind faith. It's asking you to arrive there using reason. You need to think. But then he says, actually, we can't trust reason at all. So what can we trust? How do we arrive at the answer that you want us to have, Yaser Qadhi, without saying because it comes from God, without invoking authority? He hasn't given that.
Yeah. By the way, would you agree that we can't define reason? I was thinking about that. I feel like you can't. Like there definitely are definitions of reason.
I think it's a distraction of a discussion to have, because we're not sitting in a philosophy class right now talking about what is reason and how do you define reason. He pulls that card when he wants to distract us from how Islam doesn't have good answers. He says it's like the Jordan Peterson move of, what do you mean by reason? What do you mean by question? What do you mean by religion? Well, how about you answer the question first? And so he's just getting us to go on this wild goose chase of, what does anything mean? You know what? I'll take your answer because I can't trust my method. But he hasn't given us a method. He's just given us an answer that doesn't agree with reason or rationality or looks suspicious. Let's just, define it that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Amon Ra, for the super chat. Just wanted to highlight, based on what we were saying earlier, according to the Bible, Abraham, David, and many others owned concubines. So, yeah, for the Christians who like to point out how horrible Islam is for this one thing that Christianity doesn't have, Christianity does have that as well.
In our own lives, how many times have we undertaken a course of action thinking this is so logical, this is so reasonable, this is so the correct decision, and the next day, the next week, the next month, the next year, we look back and we say, what a dumb decision I made. How could I have been thinking that? Isn't it? We ourselves experience this.
This is so unfair. This is
extended just a little bit further, just a tiny bit further.
Just a little bit more, yeah. If only, right?
Yeah. How could I have been wrong about Islam? Some people think that, but he's incapable of thinking that. He just says, I have been wrong about other things in my life except this. This I can never be wrong about. Never. And he uses it as reason to say, maybe you could be wrong about being wrong about Islam. But he doesn't accept that you could be wrong about believing in Islam. Yeah.
Yeah, like I think the examples they showed was buying a home or getting married. That's what the thought bubbles of those people had. But I mean, again, it's like no one's claiming that reason, like using reason, is going to lead you to a perfect solution. No one's saying reason is perfect.
Yeah.
But wouldn't it be better to use some reason, or as much reason as you can, for certain big life decisions, like the person I'm going to marry, or